Godot Tutorials is not sponsored by or affiliated with the Godot game engine. Welcome back. I'm Josie, and I'll be your guide for this episode. In this episode, I will touch on a few things. What is fantasy? Why should you care about fiction? The game fiction Trinity, the core elements of fiction, and the evolution of fiction. Before I begin, please take this episode with a grain of salt. I am no professor, nor a researcher. I'm just simply a person that loves to learn from history and read books about history when I'm able to. This episode is a summarization of what exactly I have learned and how it can be applied to games. I personally believe we can learn from our past to create and craft a better future, and for the purpose of this episode, better and more intuitive games than our predecessors. If mistakes are made, please share them in the comments down below. So, what exactly is fantasy? The dictionary definition of fantasy is a literature in the form of prose, especially short stories and novels, that describes imaginary events and people. However, fantasy is simply just a subgenre of fiction. This concept is important because if fantasy is just a subgenre of fiction, and for all the programmers out there, this means that since fantasy is a subclass of fiction, then really, we need to think about fiction. So, what exactly is fiction? The basic definition of fiction is basically something invented by the imagination. This leads perfectly into the next section about why you should care about fiction. The reality is your game will most likely deal in a fictional world, and the subgenre of fantasy is a great place to start due to its history. Naturally, fantasy feeds inspiration, and it helps us out when coming out with new and unique ideas. Let's take a better look at this through what I call the game fiction trinity. The game fiction trinity is a simple concept. When dealing with fiction in games, you may find yourself dealing with one of three subgenres of fiction. They are fantasy, science fiction, and horror. Let's start with fantasy. Fantasy involves a mythical or unexplained base that resides in the supernatural realm. Basically, fantasy revolves around the themes of magic, mythology, folklore, and exotic fantastical worlds. Technically speaking, fantasy resides in the speculative realm, or as the famous creator of the Twilight Zone Rod Serling once said, fantasy is the impossible made probable. Next is science fiction. Science fiction involves a world where science and technology explain the impossible. Basically, we are dealing with a world that feels very possible. And as Rod Serling once said in the same breath, science fiction is the improbable made possible. Lastly, there is the subgenre of horror. Horror is unique in the fiction world, as its fictional setting's main driving force is fear. Fear can be in the form of many things. In some cases it is by using monsters and creatures, such as the alien xenomorph in Alien's Isolation, and even the use of human fear itself, which is the scariest form for any horror. But that's not all. It's also quite possible to use a combination of these three subgenres of fiction to create something rather unique. These would include science fantasy, sci-fi horror, and dark fantasy. Next, let's look at what makes fiction unique. And it's quite simple really, because fiction touches on two core elements, imagination and the unknown. We are getting into the spiritual realm here, but I believe humans for the longest time have been drawn to these two elements. If I had to break them down, I would say that imagination deals with things such as monsters, magic, worlds, weapons, heroes, and superpowers, while the unknown deals with subjects such as death, rebirth, and of course the afterlife. The main aspect of what makes the unknown unique is that it begs these questions. If there is an afterlife, are we the same person in the afterlife? Will my conscious self carry forward even in death? If I am reborn back from the dead, will I be the same person? By the way, the idea of being the same person after rebirth is a core element of the game Nier Automata, and I believe it to be a unique game in that regard. Lastly, let's look at the evolution of fantasy. First and foremost, I want to say that the evolution of fantasy is complex, and this is my attempt at condensing it into a single episode. In my opinion, the evolution of fantasy, and in broader terms fiction, looks more like a river, where genres branch out starting from the epic poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh. For the sake of simplicity, I will break the evolution of fantasy down, as though they evolved sequentially. Let's start with the verbal. Stories from the dawn of mankind started to survive the unknown. Communities shared and passed stories from generation to generation as a form of teaching and survival. It's a very powerful form of communication, as it allowed the generations of the past to communicate with the generations of the future. Drawings were the first form of written communication. But in terms of story, we move to epic poems. The first epic poem, and the first story of fantasy in recorded history, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written in as early as 1700 BC. In this case, we have our very first superhero, prophetic dreams, descent into the underworld, the first quest at obtaining eternal life. Creatures, such as dragon and zombies, are touched upon in this epic poem. The second most important thing is the aspect of character development. Gilgamesh is 2/3 god and 1/3 man. It's there to explain why Gilgamesh is prideful at the beginning, but that ending is emotional, or at least it was emotional to me, and it shows why movies and books of our modern-day era choose to adapt elements found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Finally, the most important aspect that would forever change the world of fiction, the first case of the famous blueprint, the monomyth, also referred to as the hero's journey. The hero's journey will be talked upon in another episode, but know that the Epic of Gilgamesh was the first to use it. I like to bring this epic poem up because it solidifies the fact that nothing is new. The ideas of zombies are not new, dragons are not new, heroes are not new. So don't worry about creating something new, instead focus on creating something unique that you can pass and share with the world. The next epic poem I want to bring up is Dante's Infernal. What's so special about this book is that it's the first in written history that explain in very graphic detail about hell, purgatory, and paradiso or heaven. It touches on elements such as descending the underworld, creatures, prophetic dreams, and most importantly trying to understand how heaven and hell works. Both these epic poems also touch on the core concepts of the imagination and the unknown, which you may start to see are two recurring core elements you'll find in many works of fiction. After epic poems, we see a shift to books. The two books I'd like to introduce is Gulliver's Travel of 1726 and Frankenstein of 1818. Gulliver's Travel shares themes of traveling to exotic lands, corruption, and exploration, while Frankenstein touches on themes such as creation, ambition, and the first ever sci-fi horror. What makes Frankenstein so great is the idea of creation and becoming godlike. Natural life, such as real life, has laws that cannot be bent, but fantasy and horror allow people to invent a world with its own laws, which is the nearest humans can come to creation. In a sense, it's the closest humans can achieve to becoming godlike. And as a matter of fact, games are similar in that regard as well, since in games you are creating a world with your own laws and rules that differ from that of the real world. In that sense, creating games is the closest thing to becoming godlike as well. I believe the creator of the Sims games mentions this in an interview that escapes my mind right now. One thing to note is that the mix of fantasy and horror are inspired by religious doctrine, or at least address the topic of religion. Moving on, next on the list, we see short stories. What makes short stories so great is how well they can be used in themes of horror. We can see two examples, such as The Traveling Companion of 1835 by Hans Christian Andersen, which touch on the themes of death, rebirth, evil versus good, and redemption, while on the other side, we can take a quick look at The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which touches on the themes of guilt, madness, and death. I want to briefly talk about Edgar Allan Poe. Even though, technically speaking, Frankenstein is considered the first Gothic horror, please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Edgar Allan Poe is the one that mainstreamed the concepts of Gothic themes into horror, and more specifically mainstreamed horror stories. You'll see that Gothic themes play well into horror. One such example of that is Resident Evil Village. On top of that, Edgar Allan Poe argued and believed that short stories are the best way to convey horror, and more specifically, fear onto readers. Next, let's look at technology advancement in history along with war. Some important technologies that happened were the wireless telegraphy of 1894 and the first motion picture of 1895. Keep in mind that fantasy, horror, and science fiction would be inspired and innovated by these two technologies. On top of that, we have our three big wars: World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, which lead humanity to participate in the famous space race that started in 1959 and ended in 1969, with the United States landing on the moon. What makes history and technology fascinating is that before they happened, they were only dreamed and talked about in fiction, mainly science fiction. However, real-life technology and history are real, not fiction. And so, when fiction one day becomes reality, it inspires stories in science fiction to tackle the next big thing. Let's look at some examples through movies. In this case, I want to touch on two movies, which by the way you can stream in America on HBO Max. So if you have the chance to, watch them while they are viewable as of August 28, 2021. The first is Night of the Living Dead of 1968. It touches on a few themes, such as fear, teamwork, eternal life, and death. The most important aspect is how it handles the zombie genre. From what I learned back in college, it was the first zombie movie to introduce multiple zombies. Before this movie, the concepts of zombies were not new. However, it was generally one zombie taking out one or multiple people, sort of like a mummy movie. And on top of that, the singular zombie was born out of supernatural origins or fantastical scientifical origins, such as the case of Frankenstein. But Night of the Living Dead was the first to introduce multiple zombies in movies, and the first to introduce the rules of zombies that we know and love today. For example, shooting a zombie in the head to end them, and that zombies are created by some scientific phenomenon that could affect multiple corpses, instead of some supernatural aspect. Basically, this movie would birth the creation of the modern-day zombie. Lastly, this movie had a diverse cast for its time, and I would argue diverse for our time, especially with the co-stars, one being African American, and the other being a woman. This movie would also later inspire games such as, you guessed it, the Resident Evil franchise. Next on the list is Space Odyssey of 1968. It touches the themes of technology, exploration, evolution, artificial intelligence, and death. I bring this up because of the fact I teach programming, and believe it or not, we are almost there. Artificial intelligence was a unique, and possibly scary thing back then, and it still is today. The main horror theme is touching the fact that robots, which are inanimate objects, are gaining, or will one day, gain self-awareness. It's basically as if a rock, or a chair were to one day gain self-awareness. It's creepy, right? Next, we move into comic books. Now comic books started in 1933, the lead-up during the Second World War for America, and the start of World War II politics for Germany. Regardless, comics gave us the Bronze Age of comics, which can teach us a lot about how masks don't just protect the identity of its wearers. It also projects the reader onto the hero, making for a great immersive experience for readers of comics. But more specifically, you can see a trend start to go back to more classical fantasy in comics during the 1970s, with DC Comics' Weird War Tales and Conan the Barbarian, both which touch on fantasy. This leads us to our very first fantasy board game that we know and love today, which is Dungeons & Dragons of 1974. Now role-playing games are nothing new. They started in the 1970s, but personally, the Dungeons & Dragon games may very well be the one that mainstreamed fantasy role-playing games, and basically inspired many genres of RPGs and video games as well. Some themes touched upon Dungeons & Dragons is the fantasy world, exploration, magic, the hero's journey, creatures such as dragons, and of course death. Lastly, I want to touch on the fact that Dungeons & Dragons is a really great game to practice game design, as it forces dungeon masters to understand about the players at the table, in order to create a world that engages everyone. In a sense, D&D is perhaps a tool that helps shape future aspiring game designers, as shaping and crafting player experiences is exactly the thing a good dungeon master is able to do, which in a sense, makes them a game designer. And finally, fantasy evolved into video games. The two I want to bring up are Jak and Daxter, and Bioshock. Let's start with Jak and Daxter. The themes of Jak and Daxter may look familiar to you, as these are nothing new at this point in the history of fiction. We have themes of exploration, fantasy, magic, technology, friendship, and of course life and death. What personally makes games unique is that the concept of death is not taken seriously. You don't die, you just start back at the last checkpoint. It would be a very boring game if the game ended the moment you died, or at minimum very frustrating to play. Next up is the famous Bioshock game. The Bioshock game follows in the footsteps of the past, by following the themes of exploration, technology, survival, and of course life and death. Now what makes this game interesting is that it is the first game that was able to execute the idea of branching stories, which we will touch upon later in this series. It's one of many games I recommend investigating and learning from if you are interested in branching story themes. Another notable game on branching story themes would be Mass Effect, which executes it in a different manner towards the end. Wow, that was a lot. In conclusion, the three types of fiction, which are fantasy, science fiction, and horror, will have elements of imagination and the unknown weaved into their stories. There are of course many different types of fiction subgenres, but I believe that understanding the history of fantasy, along with the core basics of fantasy, science fiction, and horror will help you on your game designing journey. Let's look at your homework for this series. It is to simply read, or listen to, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a short read, perhaps 5 hours, or 2 hours if you choose to listen to someone. Also, here's some tips on reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. The epic poem was released in 1700 BC, so it's old, and it's regarded as the oldest recorded fictional story in history. To give some perspective, that book was written about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. It's lived through countless evolutions in technology, culture, religion, politics, and economics. Keep that in mind. Lastly, back in those days, I believe a woman courting a man was symbolic of men being uncivilized, and women were the only ones capable of civilizing. You guessed it, uncivilized men. Okay, there we go. Once you've finished reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, ask yourself these questions. What are 3 things you liked about it? What are 3 things you disliked about it? From there, list some movies you've watched that contain the things you liked or disliked. After that, check to see if you have any Disney movies on your list. We will get back to that in a different episode. Well, that's all I have for you in this episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for clicking the like and subscribe button. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Have an amazing day.